Going to flush that out with some naphtha. So I'll just splash some naphtha in there and then work the mechanism repeatedly. Repeat. And basically what that's doing is the naphtha is softening or dissolving any old oils or greases, and by blowing them out you're blowing away the naphtha with the oil and grease it's picked up. That should leave it nice and clean. If you just soak some naphtha in there and then let it evaporate away, you'll be left with all the oil that you started off with, which would be no use to you. You have to get it nice and soaking wet with naphtha and blow the naphtha out so that it carries away the impurities. No point leaving the impurities there. Okay, well that's good now, that's nice and snappy in its action, it returns under its own steam. That's exactly the sort of thing I want. Pop that to one side. I need to clean the retainer and the blade actuating ring. So I'll just give this a quick clean. This is the face that goes towards the mechanism plate. It's a bit marked. That's where the blade actuating ring has been sitting against it. It's probably, though some of those marks will be dried out oil, I would think. You can certainly see a fingerprint on here. Someone's picked that up at some stage. Always handle these pieces by the edges. If you wanted to go over the top, you could be using watchmaker's finger cots or rubber gloves. That might be overkill. These black marks that are coming off here, that's possibly graphite from the grease, or it's possibly just worn away metal. Alright, that looks quite good. Those parts are clean. They need to go back onto the mechanism plate now. Now there's a little lever on here that actually moves the mechanism plate, the blade actuating ring directly. That's moved by the B and T levers. I'm just making sure that moves freely, and I'm fairly confident it sits in that position. I don't want to get it on the wrong side of the stud, otherwise I'll find that the plate it doesn't work. But I think that's the correct way. If I'm wrong, well, I'll have to redo it. 3 screws, and in this case they're all identical. To get them all in place, once they're all in place, tighten them up. Check the action, make sure that's smooth. That feels good. So look on the other side. And that lever does indeed shift that nicely by itself. Right, so the mechanism plate now is pretty clean. I need to put the little lever that operates the blade actuating ring in place. And that's its retaining screw there, I think. So I'll clean these components and then we'll pop those in place. Okay, let's get this little lever. I've just been cleaning that lever and I was wondering why it was that the dirty marks were getting bigger instead of smaller as I cleaned it, and it turns out that the nickel plating was coming away. So the dirty marks that I was seeing was the underlying steel. Get this in position. That's not a serious problem, and certainly not something I need to do anything about. If the nickel was coming off in sheets at the bottom of the lever, I might have to remove it completely to ensure it didn't end up jamming things up, but I don't think that's the case. It's just little bits at the top here. It probably means that that piece of metal wasn't prepared well enough before it was plated. That's very snappy in its action. That blade actuating ring is working fine. So some graphite powder to lubricate this. People sometimes ask, you know, why graphite powder, why not this magic potion or that magic potion? Well, one answer of course is that graphite powder is what I've got in front of me, and it's what I happen to know does work. So I don't need to go looking for trouble if I've got a solution in hand already. And I'll just put a bit of graphite powder on the retard gear train and just work those gears. Something's sticking there. What have I picked up? I think I've just picked up a bit of fluff or something there. Let me find out what I've done. Yeah, just picked up a little bit of fluff from one of the cotton buds and managed to find its way into an inopportune place and caused me grief. That's all good, and that really is ready to have the blades put in place. So I'll pop that to one side. I need to deal with these blades. These are the shutter blades. Just looking at the state of these. They're fairly marked. Some of those marks are marks that I've probably managed to get in there just by spraying solvent in there when I was trying to get the lens off the front. And some of these marks are probably there of long standing. Excuse me. Right, hopefully no more interruptions. Just one of my friends had come round, rang me early today to say his computer wouldn't go. So I said, well, bring it round and we'll see what we can do. And he turned up with it without its external power supply, so I had to send him away to get that. But once he came back with the power supply, we checked that. There was nothing wrong with the power supply, but the computer would not go. So it's had its day. Probably needs a motherboard or something. So he was sent off to the shops to check out the prices of replacements. So he'd just come back with all his pieces of paper and different prices to be advised on what was going to suit him best. It probably tomorrow, or Monday if I can put it off, yeah, Monday, I'll have the joy of setting it up for him and transferring in all his files. I'm just looking at the state of these blades. They're a little bit marked. No serious problems there. The marks are probably very fine surface corrosion. These blades are reinforced. They have an extra layer of metal at this end, which is what the rivets that you see there are for. They hold this extra piece in place. Now that was only done in the early days of these shutters, and later on they did away with that. And I think they probably just increased the thickness of the metal that they used for the later blades so that they didn't need a reinforcing piece. I think those will be fine. Right, so we've got our mechanism plate nice and clean. I'll unhook that spring, move that lever across so that is in the blade's open position, and start laying my blades in place. The blades are going on that way. I'm just looking at the state of these blades so that if there are any that are marked, I'll make sure it's the one at the back. Blades go on in that direction. So the front of the blades look here. Call that the prettiest. Okay, the blades are in position. Put that on my all-purpose scarred block of wood. The case in position. Just lining up my screw holes here so I know which way this fits on the plate. That's right. 3 screws hold the case together. If I can get this seated correctly. I haven't decided who it is with that chainsaw today, but they've been pretty persistent, so they must be chopping down something big over the back that I can't see. Just do those screws up lightly. I want to make sure that all the blades have stayed in position, that nothing was dislodged from its position. And they open and close smoothly. That appeared to be good. I'll put that spring in place now. It's nice and snappy in its action. I can do those 3 case screws up now. And this little lever here would be operated by the B lever, and that is all working smoothly too. So that part looks very good, and I can clean and reassemble the components onto the mechanism plate now. Right, let's see if I can get this back together in a useful sort of a fashion. If you put the pieces in just the right order, everything goes very smoothly. Otherwise you get two of the pieces in and discover that you should put one of the other bits in first, which is frustrating. So I'll start with this catch. A little catch that its job is to hold the shutter in the cocked position once you've cocked it until you press the shutter release. That's good. This little lever here is the B lever. It's got a little bush and a screw that holds the bush in place. See if I can get that seated correctly. And get its spring in position. The tail of the spring acts against that little lever there, and it doesn't want to. How's that? That looks good. Check that the lever moves smoothly. That's a bit reluctant to move, that lever. That's not exactly springing back into position. What's going on there? It's catching on something, rubbing on something. Is it the spring? Is it catching on the case? The spring's certainly misshapen. I'm just going to have to straighten that up. It's pointing up in the air a bit, and that appears to be causing me some problems. Yeah, it is. It's a little bit bent. Let's see if we can encourage that to sit flatter. Try that. One of these jobs that would be handy to have three hands for. Yeah, that chainsaw noise is getting a bit tedious. So the screw's finally started in the hole. Get that centered up on the bush. Now, still dragging. This bear's better. No, something is dragging. Doesn't appear to be the spring. I think it was just rubbing on the case here. That arm must be slightly bent. It's not uncommon for it to be slightly bent. It's the various levers do get a bit of a hiding, particularly when people set things wrong and then start pushing and pulling on the levers to and wonder why they don't respond in the way they were hoping for. Okay, that'll do. Here's the little shutter release lever. I'm going to make sure its spring is in place, and it is. It sits on that post there. Oops, on the wrong side of something. That's better. So the T lever drops in at the moment because there's nothing to stop it from dropping in. So on the first action it opens the shutter, on the second action it closes it. What's happening there or not happening? Well, the B lever was not lifting back out of position, back out of engagement. It should lift out of engagement at that point. As I said, there's it's not uncommon for this mechanism to be a bit buggered up, and it was when we started. I had hoped that would go away when I'd cleaned it. So it's latching into the B position, but this lever's not dropping over. That's it. So that lever there is not dropping down as far as it should. So there was just a hint of bent out of alignment on that lever there. That's moving perfectly now. I'm just going to put a little touch of molybdenum paste on the tip of that lever where it runs over that post. That all looks good. Right, so the high speed spring, the spring that gives us our 500th of a second speed, goes over this post, and this lever, oh yeah, I'm still on camera, that's amazing. This lever returns it's got a return spring for the shutter release. It releases the shutter when the plunger's engaged. Right, and the plunger screws into this socket, which goes in the side here. This is also the spot where the flash sync connection was on later shutters. They used this position to do the flash sync connection. That's good. Now the plunger. What about this plunger? Is it smooth in its actions? Is it hell? These are often not smooth. I'm going to clean this first in case it's just a bit gummy with oil or grease. But the shafts get bent, and they get bent because if the shutter gets rotated in the housing at all, then this will catch on the door as people try to force the camera closed. And if the shaft gets bent, it just doesn't want to move. It seems a bit better now, so it may just have been a bit gummy. Yeah, that seems quite good. I'll give that a touch of molybdenum paste. Good, good. Everything very good at the moment. Let's get that main lever done. That's looking a bit crusty. I hope that's just dirty grease on there. We'll find out in a second. That retard gear train, what's that like? Is that behaving itself? It is. Pop that to one. So let's put some molybdenum paste in here while I'm at it. Some on that lever, some on the tab on the top of that lever, some here and some here. That'll do. This piece, this needs to be cleaned. It's very, very dirty looking. Hopefully that's dried grease and not rust I'm seeing. Right, that's cleaned up, and it cleaned up well. So a wipe with molybdenum paste on the inside edge, on the outside edge, on the tip of the bird paw, and on the tail of that bird paw there. Just looking at the state of this spring. Now, let's get this in position. That looks like it's in position. Let's get its spring in place. That's better. That seems to be good. And I'll clean the speed cam and put that in place. Right, just run some molybdenum paste around the inside edge in particular, and around the cam surfaces where the various levers have to follow this, the B lever and so forth. And in this, the 500th of a second spring is compressed by the settings cam at that point. So I'll just put a bit of molybdenum paste there. Let's drop this into position. The B lever's not trapped, that's good. Let's cock the shutter. It's not cocking. What's happened here? Oh, our catch here is in the wrong position. Okay, let's just lift the top off. Yes, the arm of this is in the wrong position there, so let's see if we can cheat and wriggle that in place. I'll remove that main lever. See if I can lift my shutter release lever enough to get that under. I can indeed. That's better. Now put that back in place. Get the spring back on the post. Check that that's correct. That looks good. Get our speed settings cam in place. Right. Now cock the shutter, it cocks and it fires. Okay. Now B and T. That's T. That's T. B should be there. That works too. Right, the shutter shows every sign of working. So I can put the cover on the front now. Now this was difficult to get off to start off with, and I'm not sure why. It just bayonets into position, but it didn't want to unbayonet. Where's the lock position is there. So that should fit on like that, and if I rotate that into position, should be able to, there we go, lock that into position. I'm just checking these speeds. The 500th of a second position brings into play that heavier spring. You always have to set the speed before you cock the shutter, not after. If you try and cock the shutter after you cock the shutter first and then set the speed, you're not going to get there. It won't like it. If you do achieve it, it won't be doing anything any good. Always set the speed, then cock the shutter. Well, that sounds pretty good to me. I'll have to test those, but they sound plausible. The nameplate. Let me put the nameplate back on the shutter. Not uncommon for the nameplate to be missing. And I think there were There are at least 2 designs of nameplate, there may have even been more. It seems to go very well. I think that's my shutter done. Now I just need to clean the lens. Well, there we have it. The lens is clean and back on the shutter. It screws on nice and tight, but it can be undone with the fingers. It certainly wouldn't be a problem to get that off with a friction tool, as it should be. Well, I think that's probably it. I can put this onto the camera now, I think, and see how we get on. I'll just clean this retainer ring. Retainer rings are often a little bit different in style. This one is sort of countersunk on the back face. A bit interesting. Drop the retainer ring in place. And see if I can do that up without it being a major fight. That's good. I've got to position this correctly now so that the infinity mark shows up correctly on there. That shutter should be round a bit further, something like that. And then get it tightened up without moving it so that it stays firmly in the correct position. And this is always somewhat of a challenge. Often it involves a bit of toing and froing, tightening things up, loosening it, shifting it, tightening it back up again. Just checking the position of my infinity mark there, that's good. Right, let's try tightening it up there a little bit more. If it's not really snug, you run into trouble, because when you go to cock the shutter on the 500th of a second speed, there's a lot of resistance. And with a lot of resistance, it means that you tend to rotate the shutter accidentally. That's fine. There, I've got it on the 500th per second speed. There's no indication that the shutter's moving at all. So that's good. Well, that is just about it for this camera, I think. Final dust off. And a final wipe to remove any fingerprints. What else? Oh, that little piece of leather on the corner of the door there. See, that's sticking up? I'll see if I can glue that back down. So, I'll just use some solvent there to make sure that that is all clean and grease free. tiny spot of adhesive. On this, as with other very early Retina models, the leather wraps around the edges of the door. On later models they don't. With the leather wrapping around the edges of the door there's two major factors for that as far as I'm concerned. It means that if you want to remove the leather, perhaps to get Zeiss bumps or something out from underneath, it is very, very difficult because the leather's thin. It also means that the leather is prone to damage if it's been roughed up in any fashion. If the door gets distorted, the edge here particularly will catch on the body as it folds into position, just like here, and instead of lying flat it gets pulled back. That looks good. I'm just checking to see if that folds into the body smoothly. It appears to. There's no other edges that are loose. That's scuffed, but it's not loose. Oh, and that green verdigris that was very visible under there has all been cleaned away. That's the stand, by the way. That's for when you're wanting to take photos on the tabletop. That's your tabletop tripod. Of course, you're taking in portrait mode, but then again, portrait mode was a very common thing to want to do with a small camera at this time in the 30s. Well, there we have it. That's our Retina I Type 118, and this was the second model of Retina camera made, and improved on the original one by replacing that little knob on the top that you had to turn a quarter of a turn or so between shots, to putting a single lever on the back which you can just flick across, and sprung loader just returns to position again. But there we have it. That's a good example, and that can go back to its owner. And what was done to it? Well, the shutter certainly needed to be serviced. It sort of functioned, but B and T did not function. B and T do function now. The focus helical was quite stiff with dried out grease. The aperture settings was quite stiff. The film advance didn't lock successfully. As you rotated this, it tended not to lock into place automatically. It wanted to skip. That's all good. Anything else? Oh, not much to... Oh, just the usual fights that you have with cameras trying to get them apart. Of course, getting the lens off the front of the shutter was entertaining. I haven't had one fight like that for a while. The struts were quite good. They were pretty grimy, but they weren't particularly bent. That can go back to its owner now. Thanks for watching.